In June 1942, the Desert War changed with a speed that stunned both soldiers and governments. Tobruk, the fortified Libyan port that had once symbolized British and Commonwealth endurance, fell to Axis forces on the 21st of June after a rapid, violent campaign. For the Eighth Army, this was not just the loss of a place on the map, it was the collapse of a shield, a depot, a harbor, and a reputation. Rommel's Panzer Army Africa now surged eastward toward Egypt, and the British retreat began to feel less like maneuver and more like a race against disaster. The story after Tobruk matters because it shows armored warfare at its most unforgiving. Tanks and trucks moving fast across open ground, commanders trying to hold together broken formations, fuel and repair columns deciding what could still fight, and a battered army searching for one line where it could finally stop running.
If you would like to move beyond the podcast, you can see my available books at militaryauthor.me. And at trackpads.com, you will find magazines and galleries with hundreds of thousands of photos and videos to explore. To understand the shock of Tobruk's fall, it helps to remember what the port had meant. Earlier in the war, Tobruk had resisted Axis attack for months and had become a symbol of stubborn defense in the Western Desert. Its harbor allowed supplies to be brought closer to the front, and its fortified perimeter gave British planners a point around which they could organize operations. By 1942, however, the situation had changed. The Axis victory at Gazala had unhinged the British position in Libya, and Tobruk was left exposed at the wrong moment, under the wrong assumptions, against an enemy who had learned how to combine speed, artillery, anti-tank fire, and tactical pressure. When the garrison surrendered, tens of thousands of Allied troops were lost as prisoners, along with stores and equipment that the Eighth Army could not easily replace in the middle of a retreat.
Rommel's success after Gazala was not the result of tanks alone, even though the image of German panzers racing through the desert has often dominated the memory of the campaign. His method depended on the coordination of mobile forces, reconnaissance, anti-tank guns, artillery, engineers, and a command style that pushed decisions forward aggressively. German and Italian units had developed a way of fighting in the desert that could turn apparent weakness into opportunity. When British armor attacked in a piecemeal fashion, Axis anti-tank guns could punish it. When British units lost contact with one another, German mobile groups could exploit the gaps. When a defensive position was bypassed or isolated, morale and supply began to fail before the final assault even arrived. Tobruk's fall therefore revealed something larger than a single defeat. The British still had not mastered the combined arms battle as consistently as their enemy.
The Eighth Army's retreat eastward was a mechanical and human ordeal. The desert offered enormous space, but that space did not make movement simple. Vehicles broke down, recovery teams had to decide what could be saved, and fuel columns became as important as fighting units. A tank without petrol was a bunker. A gun without ammunition was a burden. A brigade without communications could become lost even while surrounded by open sky. Dust-clogged engines, heat-exhausted crews, and hurried withdrawals turned workshops, dumps, and headquarters into scenes of confusion. The British and Commonwealth forces were not merely falling back from one battlefield to another. They were trying to preserve enough organization to remain an army, because an army that retreats too quickly can lose its structure long before it loses its last tank.
At the center of this crisis stood the question of Egypt. The Axis advance was no longer a distant threat somewhere in Libya. It pointed toward Alexandria, the Nile Delta, and the Suez Canal, which was one of the great strategic arteries of the British Empire. If the Axis could break into Egypt and disrupt the canal, the consequences would reach far beyond the desert. Shipping routes, Middle Eastern oil, and Allied communications with Asia all seemed to be at risk. This is why the retreat after Tobruk carried such emotional and political force. It was not simply that Rommel had won another desert battle. It was that a long chain of British imperial defense appeared to be bending under the weight of armored maneuver, and no one could yet be certain where it would stop. The battlefield itself encouraged dramatic reversals. The Western Desert was not empty in the simple sense, but it lacked many of the fixed features that armies often use to anchor a defense. There were tracks rather than roads, escarpments rather than neat front lines, and supply dumps that mattered as much as villages. Armored formations could swing around a flank if there was room, but only if they had fuel, maintenance, and navigation good enough to keep moving. This made the desert a theater where operational mobility was everything. A commander who moved faster than the enemy could make a strong line irrelevant, but a commander who outran his logistics could find his spearheads stranded. After Tobruk, Rommel was still dangerous because he had momentum, but that momentum depended on fragile supply lines stretching back across a battered Libyan battlefield. The British command system was also under strain. General Claude Auchinleck, the Middle East commander who took direct control of the Eighth Army during the crisis, faced the immediate problem of stopping a victorious opponent without allowing the retreat to turn into a rout. His decisions have been debated, but the emergency was real. Units had been damaged at Gazala, reserves were scattered, and the speed of Axis pursuit made it difficult to establish a stable plan. British armor had often been committed in ways that left tanks unsupported by infantry, artillery, or properly sighted anti-tank guns. Communications between formations were uneven, and commanders sometimes fought separate battles rather than one connected action. The retreat after Tobruk therefore exposed not only battlefield losses, but deeper weaknesses in doctrine, staff work, and battlefield coordination.
The next major attempt to make a stand came around Mersa Matruh, inside Egypt, where the British hoped to delay or stop the Axis advance. Yet this position also proved vulnerable, because the desert still allowed movement around and between defended localities. The result was confusion, hard fighting, and another withdrawal. For the listener following the action without a map, the important point is that the Eighth Army was being pushed east along the Mediterranean coast, with the sea to the north and wide desert to the south. Each defensive line bought time, but none yet solved the basic problem. Rommel's forces could threaten the front, probe for the flank, and create fear that another encirclement was forming. In armored warfare, the psychological effect of being outflanked can be almost as powerful as the actual movement of tanks.
Yet the Axis advance had its own dangers. Rommel's army was not an unlimited machine. German and Italian forces had been fighting hard, losing tanks, wearing out vehicles, and consuming fuel at a pace that the Axis supply system struggled to sustain. The port of Tobruk helped, but it did not magically solve the problem of moving supplies over hundreds of miles to the front. Every mile eastward made the Axis tactical position more dramatic and its logistical position more difficult. This is one of the central lessons of armored warfare in the desert. Speed creates opportunity, but it also creates hunger. Tanks need fuel, spare parts, ammunition, and recovery vehicles, and the trucks that carry those supplies need fuel of their own. The farther Rommel drove, the more his battlefield brilliance depended on a supply chain that was already under pressure from distance, Allied air attack, and maritime losses.
The retreat finally approached the place that would give the British a chance to change the character of the campaign: El Alamein. Unlike earlier desert positions, El Alamein sat in a narrow corridor between the Mediterranean Sea and the Qattara Depression, a vast area of salt marsh, soft ground, and broken terrain that was extremely difficult for large mechanized forces to cross. This mattered enormously. For much of the Desert War, commanders feared the open southern flank, where mobile forces could sweep wide and turn a line from behind. At El Alamein, that possibility narrowed. Rommel could still attack, infiltrate, and concentrate force, but he could not easily repeat the same kind of sweeping, outflanking movement that had made earlier British positions so vulnerable.
Geography began to do what battered units alone could not. It limited maneuver.
This did not mean that El Alamein was automatically safe. A narrow battlefield can stop a wide turning movement, but it can also become a killing ground if the defender is disorganized. The British still had to place infantry, guns, mines, and armor in ways that supported one another. They had to rebuild confidence among troops who had seen too many withdrawals. They had to make artillery responsive, make anti-tank defenses coherent, and keep armored reserves from being wasted in isolated charges. They also needed air support and reconnaissance to reduce the uncertainty that had so often helped Rommel. In other words, the coming stand would depend on combined arms in the fullest sense. Tanks would be essential, but they would succeed only if the army around them could find, fix, supply, and support them. The crisis after Tobruk also shaped the later victory because it taught hard lessons at terrible cost. British commanders saw again that tanks used as independent battering rams could be destroyed by well-handled anti-tank guns. Infantry learned that holding ground in the desert required more than bravery. It required mines, artillery, communications, and a clear understanding of what friendly armor could and could not do. Engineers became central because minefields and defensive belts would define the battlefield. Logistics officers became central because the ability to accumulate fuel, ammunition, and replacement tanks would decide how long an offensive or defense could continue. The desert was forcing the Eighth Army toward a more mature form of armored warfare, one in which mobility had to be integrated with firepower, protection, supply, and command control. The fall of Tobruk has sometimes been remembered mainly as a humiliation, and it was certainly felt that way at the time. But for a series on armored warfare, its importance lies in what came after the humiliation. It stripped away illusions about reputation, static defense, and the supposed decisiveness of tanks operating without proper support. It showed how a mobile army could exploit confusion faster than a slower command system could repair it. It also showed the limits of success when the pursuer's supply lines lengthened and the defender found better ground. The retreat into Egypt was therefore not just a prelude to El Alamein. It was the furnace in which the next phase of the Desert War was formed, because the British had to decide whether they would keep improvising or finally build the kind of deliberate, coordinated army that could beat Rommel on chosen ground. After Tobruk, the margin narrowed to a strip of desert before Alexandria and the Nile Delta. That is what gives this opening chapter its power. The Eighth Army had not yet won anything, and the men moving eastward could not know that El Alamein would later become a name associated with recovery and victory. They knew only that the enemy was coming, that equipment had been lost, that units were exhausted, and that another failed stand might open the road deeper into Egypt. Yet the retreat also carried the conditions for change. The geography ahead would restrict maneuver, the Axis supply problem would worsen, and British commanders would be forced to confront the failures of coordination that had cost them so dearly. The story of El Alamein begins here, not with triumph, but with a battered army discovering that survival itself could become the first step toward superiority.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.